This is the Equity Charter podcast, where we talk about why we care about equity in the digital health sector and why we think you should too. Welcome to this week's episode of the Equity Charter podcast. My name is Ayesha Rahim and I'm a psychiatrist and Chief Clinical Information Officer working in the NHS. Along with my colleagues Hassan Chaudhury and Victoria Betton, we developed 10 principles for embedding equity within the digital health sector. In this series, we'll be doing a deep dive into each principle of the Equity Charter, with 2 subject matter experts who'll be sharing their thoughts, reflections and advice on the topic. But today we're kicking off with episode 0, in which you will meet my co-founders Victoria and Hassan, as well as our very special guest Jon Hoeksma. We'll be telling you why we feel so deeply about this issue, and we'll explain how it all began. Welcome to the show, Victoria, Jon and Hassan.
Thank you for having us. Lovely to be here.
Thank you.
Lovely to be here.
So let's start off with some introductions. So if I come to you first, Victoria, can you say a little bit about yourself and your current role, please?
Yeah, so I'm Victoria Betton. I'm currently Director for Digital Data and AI at Health Innovation, Kent, Surrey, Sussex. I first joined the NHS a very long time ago, and before that I trained as a social worker. I worked in the NHS for about 25 years. I've worked independently, and now I'm enjoying working with an organisation aligned to the NHS but slightly separate to it. And I've been working in the digital health field for about 10 years, and I've always been interested in human factors, the people side of digital transformation, and always very curious about why it's so hard in the NHS.
Thank you. Okay, the same question to you, Hassan.
Thank you so much. My name's Hassan. I've had an unusual career by most people's standards. I have one exit as a founder with a real-world evidence agency that we started years ago when Lansley was around in the NHS. So that was us escaping. And after I sold my part of the business, I joined the UK government, and I was the UK government's expert on international trade and inward investment in digital health across 96 countries for 4 years. And now I'm fractional. Very lucky to be, for example, Shuri Network. I'm one of the advisors. And I'm also one of the steering committee for Rewired.
All right. And last but not least, Jon, please tell us about yourself too.
Thanks so much. So I'm Jon Hoeksma. I am a journalist, publisher, founder of several businesses. And the last 25 years, I've been kind of either writing about, reporting on, or running events on health IT and digital health. Probably the biggest kind of part of that that's best known is both the news service, but also the kind of trade show events that we've kind of developed. Firstly, EHI Live, which sold just over 10 years ago. And then more recently, Rewired, which sold last January. And throughout that period, I've also kind of had a very strong interest in convening leadership kind of networks for CIO, CCIO, CNIOs, and other popular acronyms. And the main kind of deliverable of that has been a very popular annual summer school. So lovely to be here. Thanks for the invite.
All right. Okay. Well, let's start off then with a bit of a basic question. So I don't know, Hassan, Victoria, who wants to kick us off, but can you tell us about what the Equity Charter is and what it's there to do?
The Equity Charter is a campaign for greater equity within the digital health sector. So that's thinking about the NHS, about policy organisations, and also industry that's focusing on digital health. And really, it's about advocating for greater fairness within our sector.
Okay. And why did you feel so strongly that this was an important thing to do and to think about for the sector?
I think that digital health has so much potential. The chance for us to modernise healthcare using the technology and the capabilities at our hands. But there's also a danger and a risk that we leave people behind, we exclude people. That was always the case. But there was an incident that took place that made me think we need to be stronger. We need to come forward, be on the front foot when it comes to the issues of equity. And that issue came around the time of an episode of Rewired. And we were all together, and I was very lucky to join you, Ayesha and Victoria, in the Speakers Lounge.
Yeah, so that was 2024?
2024. And as we sat together, we were pondering why the community had not responded in the way that we'd hoped it would to alleged comments that had come out in the press just before of a health tech founder who had been saying things, allegedly, that were so bad, they were so egregious, that I thought it was obvious it was wrong and people should be saying it. But I looked across the landscape and there were people who were not saying anything. In fact, they were covering themselves by not speaking. And there was a point that I think we've all agreed on since. The standard we accept is the standard, and we cannot let that be the standard. So it became important that we wrote an open letter. And that open letter that we wrote at the time had such traction. But our goal always was to make something lasting, a movement, to bring people on the journey, and to make sure that the community had something to hold on to that was rigorous and strong. A big thanks to Jon, because you, at the time when we spoke to you about this, you said, yeah, this is correct, and I want to be part of it. So you gave us a platform at Rewired conference for us to speak. And actually, it was you that spoke at the end of the conference. I'd love for you to tell us what you were thinking at the time, Jon.
Yeah, thanks, Hassan. It's interesting, just getting ready for this podcast was casting my mind back to 2 years ago. So the Frank Hester stuff, because it's Frank Hester we're talking about, broke in The Guardian. They'd done a series of reports, but the one which carried the kind of alleged, with inverted commas for those that can't see on the podcast, racist kind of remarks was reported the evening before kind of Rewired. And as the organizer and owner of that show, had a real dilemma, because TPP, the company owned by Frank Hester, were one of our headline sponsors. Now, for reasons which I won't go into, they'd already sort of decided they weren't going to show up at the event and they weren't going to be there. But it meant that we had branding which wasn't going to do us any favors, quite prominently kind of within the event. And we had side, just from logistics reasons, you build up a show, it's a big operation. We couldn't take down stuff that already kind of gone up at that stage. But the morning of kind of day one of kind of Rewired, I was up very early kind of writing our coverage of it and publishing that on the website. And at the opening session of the show, I felt quite strongly we had to say something. I had to kind of set out our position. So I fairly off the cuff, said that I didn't think it was behavior that reflected the community, didn't reflect the values of the sector, and that we wouldn't kind of do further business with TPP. That was essentially us kind of setting our position. Now, as a show organizer, just a step right back, it's actually great when you've got a huge issue blowing up that everyone wants to talk about and everyone gets kind of focused on, because people actually wind up sometimes doing things, which is exactly what you guys did.
Yeah, and if I cast my mind back to that as well, I remember this flurry of activity and all these conversations that took place around that time, primarily shock, of course, at the comments that had been surfaced. But then there was a bit of a lacuna, wasn't there? There was a bit of a gap and a void, and there didn't seem to be anybody sort of doing anything. And I suppose that's where we stepped into that gap. But yeah, Victoria, what was your recollection of this?
I just remember how utterly incensed we were. I don't know if you can remember, yeah. Ayesha, we were absolutely furious. And I think our response, and then some other responses that were either lukewarm or even slightly amused, actually, or knowing, like not surprised, actually made us feel even more annoyed. So that open letter was not particularly thought through, really. It was something that was born out of passion and annoyance. But because we had no idea when we threw that out into the world what was going to happen, but because we had such a positive response and so many people signing up, I think that then gave us the confidence to go, maybe there's something more we can do to create some good out of what was really an unpleasant situation. And that's when we decided to hold a summit and to bring EDI people together with chief information officers and other digital people from industry and the NHS. And that's when the notion of a charter started to emerge, and we co-designed it with them. And Hassan, I remember it was your idea to come up with a charter as well. So that one sits with you.
Yeah, and I was going to ask about that actually, because of course I think we've all seen charters and statements around equality and diversity, and they're kind of 10 a penny really. So I'm just really curious, Hassan, from your perspective, what made you think that the charter was something that had legs?
I don't like the idea of making something that's performative. I didn't want to do something and everyone would say, hey, we've put some theatre into this, some cheap struggle, and then nothing would last. And I knew there needed to be some permanence to this. So the word charter for me was just an attempt to encapsulate the permanence of something that a movement could coalesce around. If a group of us in the community felt strongly enough that we were going to make a change, we would need to do so based upon ideas, upon thoughts, upon an essential central statement. And for me, that's what the charter was. It wasn't the open letter that would be something we could coalesce around. It would be a statement of, these are our values, this is our purpose, this is our goal, this is what we're against, and this is what we're for. And that's really what I was hoping for.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of putting a bit more flesh on the bones, and now we do have a 10-principle charter, but each one of those principles has a series of actions that sits underneath them. So it isn't just a statement of intent, it's actually a practical framework as well. But I wanted to pick up a point about terminology as well, because we very specifically went for equity rather than equality. And for clarity, I just wonder if we could talk a little bit about that for a second. So I don't know, Victoria, if you want to come in and speak to that point.
Yeah, and I think just to unpick the word equity, I think we've all been learning along the way as well, because none of us would regard ourselves as EDI experts. So we've had to do a lot of our own sort of thinking and research and developing our own understanding. But the very simple difference between equity and equality, for example, is that equality is around a level playing field, whereas equity is about recognising that different groups of people have different barriers, and it's about making adjustments so that we have more fairness. So we thought that notion of equity was really important.
And I think the other thing is that we have tended to focus on the race element and the gender element as well. But of course, how we frame the charter is quite generic and applicable to all the protected characteristics. And I know that we sometimes get asked about why we focus quite narrowly, primarily on those two elements. And, you know, certainly from my perspective, my comfort zone, my knowledge, my lived experience is in those realms as a woman of colour myself. But we do get asked sometimes, don't we, about why we don't broaden what we're doing.
And I think we got some really good feedback from Joy Warmington, who's an expert in EDI in the early days. And she said to us, this isn't a zero-sum game. Often by focusing on one group, you start to create benefits for other groups. But I think it was really important that was the thing we coalesced about. That was the thing we felt strongly about, was anti-racism, anti-misogyny. So I think that's where we need to focus our efforts. But we're really aware of intersectionality and very keen to collaborate with other groups as well. And we kept it broadly open so we can expand and we don't need to narrow ourselves in the future as well.
I see that there's a battle for many equities, by which I mean women's health is a battle for women's health equity. And the battle for race equity is a battle for equity. And I can see many battles for equity. Equality is a battle that's already been won. Equal opportunities is in the law. You can't discriminate on protected characteristics. And if you were, there's a fight that you can have and you've got the force of the law with you. But when it comes to equity, it's not won. In fact, actually, we see so many fragments of the fight without a common thread for equity. And therefore, an equity charter will inevitably support every single one of those battles. But it would be a mistake to be too broad at the beginning. It's about making headway in an area and then saying this is something that can support all battles for all equity. So the reason I gave the example of women's health is because I think it is a crying shame, and it really is a disgrace how women are treated when it comes to access, when it comes to care. There's so many examples when it comes to research and development. And you look at the 10 principles of the Equity Charter, it all fits. So every single battle for equity is covered by the Equity Charter. But what we're seeing is lots of different people taking the fight with a different title and a different flag and trying to win it in different places. What I'm hoping is that the Equity Charter can be a movement where people can fight their own battle for equity using it. That's why we need what you might call a broad church. And that's why a movement is so important, that is inclusive, that is respectful, that is not just an open space, but is a brave space where we can say what needs to be said.
I think that's so important. And I'm just sort of reflecting on my sort of experience with this over the last couple of years and working in this space. And I genuinely don't think our sector has had to think about equity in any great detail until these last couple of years. And I'm interested, Jon, in your perspectives on this, because you've had actually a long-standing commitment to equity well before 2 years ago when this charter came into force. And I'm just wondering if you could offer us some insights about what has motivated you, and why do you feel it's so important to be proactively supportive of causes like this?
Yeah, thanks. And I've reflected on this because I don't think there was ever a point where there was a conscious kind of thought process that I went through going, I must be more supportive of inclusivity and equity. But the route that kind of brought me to get more involved in this was largely through the kind of annual summer school event that we've been running for 13, 14 years. And that event started off pretty exclusive. It was kind of focused on NHS CIOs and CCIOs. And basically, if you didn't hold that position, the event wasn't really for you. And as the event grew, then we found that we were bringing more kind of people who were aspiring to those types of leadership roles. But we fairly quickly had kind of groups say, look, I'm really interested in digital leadership. It's the career that I want to pursue. I want to be part of this. But you're not yet kind of including content or making this an event designed to kind of appeal to nurses, for instance. So we gradually brought nurses into the fold. And I think the real turning point came in about 2019, it was 2019, where we were holding the summer school in Leeds. And Shira Chok had been to the previous year edition and said, this event's great. I really like this community. Hardly anyone else here looks like me. They're very white, still kind of, I would have said a majority of kind of men versus women at that point. And Shira kind of, in the year in between, put together and launched the Shiri Network. It was formally launched at Summer School 2019.
Network that supports women from ethnic minority backgrounds in technology.
Absolutely. And it was... I remember that sort of someone kind of took me aside as we were planning kind of Summer School 2019 and said, Jon, don't put this on as an end of day session or as a kind of fringe session. Be a bit braver and put it on as one of your opening kind of plenary kind of sessions. And I kind of thought, okay, well, it's worth taking kind of, a risk on that because you want content that's really going to land with people. One of the best things I ever did, though, it was an absolutely kind of electric session. Shira and the kind of panel she put together were all brilliant, telling their stories of some of the challenges they faced. And it helped me realize that this was, one, you were kind of growing a more inclusive kind of audience, but also it was content and values that people really connected to within our community. And it gave a much broader, or began to give a much broader kind of conception of what a leadership community around digital should be. And over time, I've become absolutely convinced that you absolutely have to have a leadership community which is reflective of the community and society it serves. And I think historically, there's been work to do.
I think that's a fair comment. And, if I can get a little bit close to the bone here, I mean, as somebody who is a white man, I imagine that you have experienced some form of pushback that, say, myself or Victoria or Hassan may not have had in quite the same way or quite so explicitly. And I'm just wondering what keeps you motivated to continue doing what you do or to sort of navigate some of those difficult things?
Yeah, I think there's I wouldn't say pushback, but I think there's two types of kind of responses you get. And one is people who are a bit more conservative and a bit more kind of less kind of open to kind of change and, having some of their kind of, views and conceptions of how things should be kind of challenged. And you do get a little bit of kind of pushback from some of those kind of groups. I'm sure you've encountered it yourself. I would say that, a lot of that is conservative with a small c. Quite a few of those people can be persuaded. There are others a bit more kind of dyed in the wool. And then I think there's more constructive kind of pushback, which is from people who say, great, you've done something. What are you going to do next? How are you going to take this further? How are you actually going to kind of live those values rather than sort of be, as Hassan was kind of saying earlier, a bit more performative? And there is, of course, always more you can do. Occasionally you think, well, it'd be quite nice to appreciate the thing you've just done before kind of being dragged over the coals of the thing you haven't done yet. But I think you have to not have just a moment in time on kind of supporting kind of equity. It's something you have to be doing on an ongoing basis and challenge yourself from time to time.
I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of visibility. We can call it performative and we should always be checking ourselves. But I'm really struck by when we do stands at HET and at Rewired and other events, we do get the odd person who's a little bit sceptical, and probably those sorts of people stay away. But we are overwhelmingly approached by people who are so delighted that this issue is being talked about and brought up. And I don't know whether you agree, Ayesha and Hassan, but I'm always struck by the enthusiasm. People want to get involved. They're really delighted to have the conversation. And so that, in a way, that just feels like at least something in itself, that there's just this little vector or this little point of connection for people that hopefully inspires people to go off and, do their own thing or keep on doing what they're already doing.
I think there's also the idea that we can't keep fighting our own battles in our own silos. Imagine that I hear someone make a comment about black women and shooting them, right? I'm not a black woman. That doesn't represent me. I can ignore that. Or should I be angry on behalf of all black women and think that's socially unacceptable and then stand for it? And that's why we need allies. That's why we need champions. That's why we need people who have the decency and the moral fortitude to say, no, I'm not standing for that. It might not be about me directly at this moment, but it still offends me. And I'm still going to be animated by that. And that's why allyship is so important. And there have been times when I've been in rooms alongside Shira Chok, and she'll say, there aren't many people in this room that look like either of us, Hassan. And so we both leave because we're not there to be tokens. And that's important. We have to keep making sure that this fight is front and center because it affects people other than me. And that's what's really important for all of us, I think.
Yeah, I definitely endorse everything that you've all said there about the community, I suppose, and even in such a digital technology-based field, I think it still all comes down to humans and change. And that's very much applicable in terms of what we're talking about here and manifesting that change that we want to see. And I should also point out that, allyship is, of course, incredibly helpful. And Jon, you have been awarded Ally of the Year in recognition of your efforts. So I think that's worth stating. So, I think it's having a community of people to lean on. And actually, from having built up the Equity Charter, I've been so bowled over by the interest and enthusiasm that was out there that I didn't realise existed until we perhaps put a name to it and there was some structure around that. And I think that really helps with motivating yourself to keep going, often in quite difficult circumstances. What I'd like to do now is to think about the impact of what we're trying to achieve. Now, I want us to paint a bit of a picture of a world that's been embracing digital health equity more fully. And I'd be interested in what you think that world might look like.
I've just come back from a very long trip abroad. And what's interesting is that the level of conversation and awareness of digital health equity is variable, and it doesn't strike me with a lot of confidence yet. To give you an idea, Some countries are focused very much on getting from low maturity to high maturity. 2 countries have done really well rapidly. Those were Egypt and Thailand, very impressive. I'm looking at what's happening in Saudi Arabia, and I'm thinking it's amazing. The amount of money and amount of momentum that they've got there is huge. But what's really interesting was the United Arab Emirates. In the UAE, there was a conversation where they were wondering who do they look to for inspiration. And in the UAE, they look to themselves now. They don't look at other parts of the world. They look at other parts of the UAE because there's so much going on there. But the conversation around equity is not an obvious one. It's not the way that it is here, not the way that it is in the UK. And when I think about the UK, I think we're still at the forefront of so many conversations. And one of them is equity. So what we do here is transferable, but it isn't a natural fit in other countries. There's a big conversation in the US around this. Equity is a big conversation. Wider determinants of health is a big conversation. You're getting that in Australia as well, but you're not getting that in places that you'd want to see it. I was in China 3 times in the last 18 months. It's not a conversation at all. So equity is something that we need to push, but it's actually not a global battle yet. It's local, it's regional, and when that's won, it has to transfer.
And in some ways, I think that's quite exciting, isn't it? Because we've got an opportunity now to model what good looks like in this space. And if I think about what a world might look like or what a community might look like with real equitable digital health interventions, for me, it's about outcomes. So you mentioned briefly, Hassan, in your answer about sort of reducing health inequalities, and that often feels a little bit more palatable to a lot of people. And that, for me, is our why. That is our purpose. So, yes, the moral argument is there. And I think, many of us acknowledge that that's the case and that's worth doing, for its own sake. But actually, the purpose of embedding all of this equity is so that no matter who you are, whatever your background, whatever your demographic, whatever your ability, you have very similar health outcomes with these digital interventions to the average person. And I don't think that's where we're at the moment.
You make a really interesting point about the health inequalities and the outcomes. People talk about them, but they don't talk about them with causality. They're not asking themselves what leads to us addressing health inequalities. And if they did, they would inevitably come back to equity. Because if you address equity early on, upstream, then we can start to consider where the health inequalities are and resolve them. And therefore, there's a causal connection. We at the Equity Charter make that causal connection intellectually. But I often find people talk about the end goal, but not in a practical manner. How can you move upstream? How can you address the dimensions? How can you have a toolkit of practical actions? And how can you build communities of practice? And the goal for me when it comes to communities of practice, and we can discuss this more, is that communities of practice come together because they're self-interested. They want to be there. They're not forced to be there. And that's why you never really get true single communities of practice. You get sub-communities. You get people who want to be train spotters and plane spotters in the spotters community. And that's what I think we really need.
I'd just add to say, I'd like to see equity threaded through everything. And I think at the moment, it tends to be, if we think about equity, it's usually digital inclusion, which is important, but it's not the only thing. We think about it to some extent in terms of health inequalities, but Hassan and I agree, we don't see that. We don't see the causality link necessarily. But when we think about things like digital strategy, transformation programs, procurement, contracting, I don't think there's a conversation about equity there, hardly at all. And that's why we constructed the Charter to start with individuals, through to leadership, through to teams, through to product, data, procurement, contracting, ending with health inequalities, which is that sort of broad outcomes bit at the end. So hopefully the Charter gives something for everyone, and it tries to thread equity through all the main sort of components of a life cycle of digital, from individuals right through to societal impacts.
I'm curious, kind of, you three as the founders of the Equity kind of charter, Do you think that the tide is going in the wrong direction of wider society is making what you're trying to do more difficult?
It feels institutionally harder, but from an individual point of view, people seem ever more committed, and maybe that's our shared stubbornness. So, even though the context is so much worse, and we feel that in some of the conversations, the priorities we see, but when it comes to the individuals that want to congregate around the Equity Charter and make a difference, I think it activates people even more. And I guess that's the beautiful thing in the midst of all this sort of global maelstrom that we're in at the moment.
I'm seeing populism starting to blur into fascism on my home turf. I live in Romford, and it's always been where different communities and populations start to touch each other that you get the most friction. And what I'm seeing personally has got worse since Southport, anti-immigrant feeling. And I wonder what this means for those who are most vulnerable, the service users who are just trying to survive, those who struggle with the cost of living, those who are struggling now with the job market that's not very good. And you put all of that together, this is not a good time for anyone. And even the billionaires are complaining. We're in a bad position. And I think to myself, how can we make sure that we keep the fight going for those who cannot fight for themselves? And that's why equity is so important. Equality is not the goal here. We have to make the adjustments so that people who are vulnerable are protected.
So that's a really good point to segue on to the future now. So we've outlined already what the Charter is, the fact that it's a flexible framework that people can adopt in the way that they see fit. But we've got lots of other plans in the future, haven't we, Victoria? I don't know if you want to say a little bit about what we've got coming up.
Yeah, so we've been taking it slow and steady because we're a group of 3 people surrounded by lots of wonderful people who want to support us, but we do have limited resources. But I feel like we've made really good headway despite that. So Ayesha, this podcast series is a way of us interviewing really important and influential people in the field, thinking through some of these topics and sharing them more widely. So, it's fantastic to get this podcast going. We've wanted to do that for some time. We have Emily and Gernak, who are facilitating our community of practice. And we had an in-person initial meeting at Hale House last year, and now we have 4 sessions planned for the coming year. So we're really excited to have the community of practice. People have always been able to sign up to support the Charter, but what the community of practice does is give people that want to take a more active role an opportunity to convene together, learn from each other, and hopefully go back out into their professional and their personal lives and take the Equity Charter there. We're working with a doctor who's developing an online learning resource for us, which is great as well. So there's going to be... I was really struck. I was at a conference last week with the Equity Charter, and the amount of people that came up asking for training was really interesting. And I think we do need to service and meet that need in some way. So having that online learning resource is a first step. Lastly, we've developed a readiness diagnostic. And so that's a workshop that we can take to digital teams, either in the NHS or in industry, where we introduce the notion of equity, talk about race equity in particular, and help teams think about where they are at in terms of maturity in relation to the 10 principles of the Charter. And we did our first test with Airlogic, who have been very supportive, and it was a great experience. We learned a lot, they learned a lot, and I know they've got an action plan now and are making changes. So we're really keen to get the diagnostic out into the world more widely so that we can have a really practical impact on digital teams all around the country.
And so if you're interested in the diagnostic, of course, you can reach out to us via our website and via our email, which I will put in the show notes. So we're coming to the end now. So I'm going to just go around each of you in turn for you to give us one final thought, reflection, or top tip to leave our listeners with. So I'll start with you, Jon.
I think it's easy to be a supporter. It's easy to kind of say, great, well done, congratulations, Ayesha, Victoria, Hassan. But I think really kind of, lending support is about doing things which aren't easy. And now I'm no longer kind of running kind of the event platforms that I used to. I'm including myself very much in that, which is what more can I do? How can I kind of support? But I know that kind of, again, that Shira's been kind of mentioned. She has spoken quite eloquently in the past about kind of allies, fair weather allies. And I think the challenge to us all, particularly us white folks like me, is to not just be fair weather allies, but be allies when it's more difficult and challenging as well.
And moving on to Victoria.
Thank you. And I really like what you said, John, and I'd like to build on that, because I think there's a lot we can do just to learn and educate ourselves. And the whole incident that we described earlier that happened at that Rewired a few years ago really got me thinking and got me realising how little I know and understand about racism, actually. So there are loads of good books out there, things you can go and explore, and maybe, Ayesha, we could put some of those in the episode notes. And something I've just been getting a bit better at is just the challenging on a day-to-day level, and just saying that doesn't sit right with me. I'm not sure about that. I wonder if there's another way to see that. And just starting a dialogue by asking a question is just such a powerful thing to do. So in the past, maybe I've shied away from that, and I'm not always going to say that I'm always brave enough to do it. But I've got a lot more confidence in challenging people individually, but also challenging when I see inequity sort of in a work context as well, and having it in my mind to bring equity up in discussions in a way I wouldn't have thought to do in the past. So those are probably quite small things that all of us can do just to bringing it into our daily lives.
Fantastic. And Hassan?
I tried to put this into 3 lines. If you see bad behavior, challenge it. If you see someone on the wrong end of bad behavior, support them. And if someone seeks your support for their bad behavior, withdraw it. And the reason I say this is because we've got a silent majority. And I don't think we should have a silent majority. And I appreciate that sometimes people think it's not their problem, it's not their place. Sometimes it feels political. But what's really important is that it becomes a silent minority, and it's the majority who are saying it's not acceptable. And that's the way that we win this fight.
That's a great tip. And if I can offer a piece of advice from my own learning, I mean, the journey that I've been on in the last 2 years of learning has been absolutely incalculable. I mean, I'm by no means an EDI expert, but I've learned so much almost every day in this last 2 years. So I would say, be humble about what you know and what you don't know. Don't be afraid of making a mistake and getting things wrong, because actually none of us get this right 100% of the time. Just be willing to learn, to grow, and to be active. And it's all incremental steps, isn't it? Nobody gets this right immediately 100% of the time in one little step. It's a series of steps, isn't it? Well, that's been a fantastic conversation. So thank you very much, everybody, for spending the time with us to go through the origins of the Equity Charter. We've got a whole host of episodes coming up where we do a deep dive in each one of the 10 principles. So what reminds me to do today is to thank you, Victoria, John, and Hassan. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Equity Charter podcast. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the series. And if you'd like to know more, go to our website at www.equitycharter.digital. You can follow our page on LinkedIn, join our community of practice, and you can also contact us at hello@equitycharter.digital.